I am delighted to welcome back to SIS Gordon Adams, who is someone in my mind doesn't need an introduction, but because he has not been here for a year, I think that
They may need it.
I'll give you an introduction. Who is an emeritus professor from SIS. He is also a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. Also, he is a nationally known expert in the intricacies of defense spending and the foreign affairs budget generally. During the 90s under the Clinton administration, he was the senior White House official for international affairs and the defense budget. He had the position of Associate Director for National Security and International Affairs at OMB at that time. And he has authored many books, most recently Buying National Security, and the book that we co-edited, Mission Creep, The Militarization of U.S. Foreign Policy. He is also recently has joined the Sanders campaign as an advisor. So, and today we will be talking about, the title is Old Wine, New Bottles, Will the 2016 Election Change U.S. Foreign Policy? So join me in welcoming Gordon Adams.
Thank you. Thank you, Shun. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. We'll go back and forth, I think, a little bit with some Q&A here.
So the way that we're going to set this up is I will ask a few questions. Gordon will answer a few questions, and then after a while, we'll throw it out to you to ask questions.
I'll answer different questions from the one she asked, just to
That
make
might
it
happen.
interesting. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Shun, for helping organize this. I'm really happy to be back here. I'm happy to see people I've seen in the classroom here today. So thank you for coming. I appreciate that. I think with no further ado, why don't you just proceed to what we talked about in terms of things that I might talk about, because there's a lot of interesting things going on in the world of foreign policy and electioneering right now.
So why don't we just
unusual stuff.
we're going to start with the basics rather than going into the campaign right away. Just sort of a basic question for talking about foreign policy and elections is, does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, the common assumption, and I talk about this in my classes, the common assumption is that foreign policy is not what determines American election outcomes, period. And that's the conventional wisdom. And, you know, there's some truth to the conventional wisdom as described. It's relatively rare for a presidential election to be determined by a foreign policy issue. And in class, we usually go through, you know, everything from 1940 to 44 to 48 to 50 and so on, and pull out elections and say, how to what degree did foreign policy play a role in the outcome of this election? Was it a major issue? Did it seem to determine votes? And the general sense is, and it's not seen, I think, terribly differently this year in general, is that foreign policy is not the determinant of the outcome. The rage that somebody like a Trump seems to have tapped into is not primarily a foreign policy rage. The income disparity issues that Bernie has tapped into are not particularly foreign policy issues, although you can always describe edges around them that are trade, or, you know, things that are unfair trade practices for Trump, or badly negotiated agreements for Sanders, or what have you. But in general, most presidential campaigns don't turn on foreign policy issues. There are rare exceptions. How much the Iraq War played in Barack Obama's success in 2008 is a matter of discussion. Probably not the only issue, but more prominent than it might otherwise be the case in presidential elections. I like to look at it in a slightly different way, because I think foreign policy does play a significant role in American elections, but not the way we traditionally think about it. And this you do see in this year's election, right? And that is that probably, to me, one of the most important issues that's going to determine how people vote in an election is, do they see the candidate as a leader? We don't usually think about leadership as a foreign policy issue, but it is. And you can find instances in American elections, I'm thinking of John Kerry in 2004, where the swift boating that cut his legs off with respect to being a capable and competent leader was absolutely central to his decline in electoral fortunes in that election. So my sense is, and Professor Murray can tell you more than I can about how this reveals itself in polling data, but is that if somebody can't establish their capabilities or their credibility as a leader, it undermines their candidacy. And that leadership isn't about, can I lead us to a more even distribution of income? It's usually about, will the world see that person as a capable leader, right? I'll guarantee you, as something well before your time period, that the issue of capability as a leader was absolutely critical in the 1960 presidential election. Absolutely critical. Was Nixon a trustworthy leader? Was Kennedy an exciting new leader, right? And that issue of leadership, I think, is really central to somebody being a credible presidential candidate. And I think it's central in this election as well. For my judgment, leadership and judgment are more important credentials, all things being equal, in a presidential candidate when it comes to foreign policy than experience and knowledge. Now that sounds almost counterintuitive, but if you think about it, or if I think about it, there have been essentially, I would say, 3 presidents, all Republicans, since 1945, who've been knowledgeable and experienced in foreign policy and national security. Only 3 since 1945, right? And they're all Republicans. They ran as Republicans. Nobody knew who Eisenhower was before he decided he was going to run for president, and the Democrats might have nominated him as easily as the Republicans, but he chose to run as a Republican. Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush. Those were the 3 presidents since 1945, in my judgment, that actually had what you'd call knowledge and experience in foreign policy. Everybody else had serious to yawning defects in foreign policy knowledge and experience. Ronald Reagan, zippity-doo-dah. No knowledge or experience in foreign policy. Jimmy Carter, commanding a ballistic missile submarine is a nice experience, but it's not a foreign policy experience. It's a defense experience, but it's not a foreign policy experience. Lyndon Johnson, his big issues in the Senate when he was into issue things was, the war on poverty, the voting rights bill, things that were non-foreign policy issues. He was not a foreign policy leader. He didn't serve on the foreign policy committees. He didn't do that kind of thing, and it kind of showed when he took on Vietnam as president, right? He didn't have the knowledge and experience, but better than that, and more important, I think, he didn't have the judgment. He made judgment calls in the Vietnam War that suggested he didn't have very good judgment about foreign policy. So judgment and the reputation, the capacity to project leadership, to my mind, are more important in the way we've thought about presidents and foreign policy than knowledge and experience. And I'm being good here. I didn't even talk about W, right? who had no foreign policy experience. I served for 5 years for President Bill Clinton, who had virtually no foreign policy experience. He was a governor. Right? His foreign policy experience was a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. So it's when we talk about the candidates and we talk about what's important and we talk about who's knowledgeable and who's experienced, and there are people in the race, and we'll talk more about them later, who play that as a very important calling card in this process, it's worth reflecting on whether that's the most important qualification that we have in mind when we're talking about foreign policy and the election of a president.
So what I'm hearing you say is that usually when many candidates do not come with foreign policy chops, but that there is some sort of a sniff test, if you will, to see whether someone has the character to be president, that people judge a candidate.
Are they credible as the leader of the presidency of the United States?
Even though people pay more attention to domestic issues.
Even though they will pay attention to domestic issues. And even though they may not be terribly knowledgeable
Right.
Their knowledge may be very, very surface, maybe broad, maybe narrow, skin deep.
So, and the candidates in this election cycle have not talked that much about foreign policy, but they have intermittently done so. But do we have any evidence of the differences between them? And to get to the title of your talk, Old Wine, New Bottles, whether there would be change, any substantial change, when one of these candidates are elected as president?
At one level, well, a good question. At one level, the rhetoric that you hear from some of the candidates in the foreign policy arena might lead you to expect there would be enormous differences or that there would be big changes in U.S. foreign policy. And perhaps the biggest outlier here is Trump, because the rhetoric that he has used suggests, right, that he would do things so differently in the area of foreign policy that it would break all the institutional and alliance apparatus that we're accustomed to over the past era since the beginning of the Cold War. Anybody in this room who believes that they can actually coherently describe Donald Trump's foreign policy, please raise your hand, because I don't think anybody can. And in fact, it's very hard to say that the rhetoric that he uses in any way would change anything. He seems to be an instinctive responder, but not somebody who has developed positions as a result of position papers or a lot of study. So would he, as a president, change dramatic American foreign policy? Yes. If you say abolishing NATO would be an important change in American foreign policy, and I kind of think it would be. I have no knowledge as to whether he would actually try to do that once in office, right? Or if you think arming Japan and South Korea with nuclear weapons, that would be an enormous change in U.S. foreign policy, because it would eliminate the deterrence effect that the United States extends over those two countries as a result of international agreements, that he would tear up trade agreements, that he'd tear up the Iran agreement. If you listen to the rhetoric, yeah, this could be a substantial change in American foreign policy. The reality that as pressed, and if you've read the editorial board interviews with the New York Times and the Washington Post that he did, and I recommend you read them because it's probably the most coherent, if it is coherent, expression of his views about how he would deal with the world, you should read them. The problem is that they often are internally contradictory. Because he's an instinct responder, it rolls back on what he just said. It isn't a foreign policy issue, but his abortion response has gone flip-flop, flip-flop in the last 2 weeks. This is kind of the way his mind works, and it's not as a result of advice. It's not as a result of position papers. So it's actually very hard to know, in his case, whether things would change enormously in U.S. foreign policy if he were elected to the presidency. The one, see if I can find it here, the one contradiction over about a 2.5 week period in an interview on February 25th, he says, "It doesn't help if I start saying I'm very pro-Israel," in talking about U.S. relationships with Israel. 2.5 weeks later, he said, "I speak to you today as a lifelong supporter and true friend of Israel," is the first sentence of his AIPAC speech. Now, what's his real position? Who knows? Right? You don't know. And in fact, he even takes some pride in saying, you don't know what I'm really going to think. You don't know what I'm really going to do. Because if I told you beforehand, it wouldn't be in a good negotiating position, right? And I wrote the book. You remember my book? It was a bestseller, the second bestseller after the Bible. And he does that and he goes off on his shtick. But how do you know what is a coherent architecture of foreign policy from this? You don't. So he's a wild card, as an instinct guy. I think everybody else falls into a pretty predictable range of old wine in new bottles. Even Ted Cruz. That when you get to his position papers and the things that he's actually put down in text, while they are at a more higher defense spending end, and some of the rhetoric is carpet bombing in Iraq, and there's a lot of very tough rhetoric here. You've got a relatively coherent design, which I would call part of the more conservative, almost neocon interventionist consensus in American foreign policy. There's a kind of wild card in there that his major foreign policy advisor is a true whack job, guy named Frank Gaffney. And, Gaffney's a little strange, but Gaffney isn't Cruz. He's an advisor. And Cruz is both, I think, smart enough and logical enough and not an instinct responder that he's got a sense of where he wants to go. And for those who are liberal interventionists, that's probably excessive. For those who are conservative interventionists, is probably more or less in the framework with a little bit of highly inflammatory rhetoric surrounding it, right? Not that different. Hillary Clinton, I would classify as a liberal interventionist. So for me, since we're now in the world of Cruz, Kasich, and Clinton, they're on a continuum for me, and it's mostly, different varieties of wine being poured into new bottles. It's still the wine. It's still two slightly alternating versions of the wine, one more neocon and interventionist, one slightly less so, but still interventionist. What's characteristic of Hillary, I think, in this campaign, and in general, I think this is true of her, she is very much within the interventionist consensus, as I would call it. I read her vote for the Iraq War as consistent with that. I read her support for regime change in Libya as consistent with that. I read her support for a no-fly zone in Syria as consistent with that. She's somebody who's generally within the centrist Democratic Party interventionist exceptionalist school of thought. The only one I think doesn't fit there is Bernie. Right? That Bernie is not of that school. Now, what's interesting about that is, as I read Bernie, if you read what he has said, and just by the way, as a question here, how many people have read Bernie Sanders' speech on Middle East policy? How many people in the room? Let me see. Don't all put your hands up at once. Sheesh, nobody. Because it's a non-event. It happened. The day of the AIPAC conference, March 12th, he didn't go to AIPAC. He gave a speech on Middle East policy in Salt Lake City, right, to a political campaign audience that probably didn't care much, to a reporting crowd that wasn't covering foreign policy anyway, and it never appeared. You can go on the web. It's on his website. It's a significant speech on U.S.-Israel relations and policy in the Middle East, which if he had given it at AIPAC, would probably have led to his being booed out of the room. I say that because I found it one of the most even-handed speeches on U.S.-Israel-Palestinian relations that I've seen probably since the days of Ehud Barak, which is now 20-plus years ago. So it's an interesting speech. I encourage you to read it. But what's interesting about it is it was a non-event. Nobody knew that it happened, right? I put him outside that because he is by and large an advocate of restraint, an advocate of diplomacy first, military use second, not an opponent of U.S. military strength, but an advocate of diplomacy first. He's an advocate of conflict prevention and conflict resolution and diplomacy. And all of this is on his website and in that speech, right? But nobody knew what happened because nobody covered it because of the way it was done, right? So he's the only one who, and he sounds a little bit like the Barack Obama Atlantic interview. Who read that interview, right? Really interesting interview, long, very interesting stuff in it. Not, I think, too different sort of temperamentally than where I think Sanders is, right? It's another talk and another lecture to talk about whether President Obama actually does what he talked about in the Atlantic interview, and that's worthy of discussion. You want to go into that in Q&A, we can do it. But you've got that continue. You've got one absolutely unpredictable instinct hitter, totally intuitive and often self-contradictory person, right? And three people who, along a continuum, are pretty much in the interventionist consensus that's common in Washington. And one person who stands at the edge of it, straddles outside it, and is not an exceptionalist or an interventionist, and is reasonably clear about that, right? But about which people aren't really terribly aware.
So that raises two questions for me. Maybe it does make sense to clarify how Bernie is different than Obama, just because if you say that he sounds like the Obama Atlantic piece, does that mean that he's, a continuation of that, of that administration? And then a second question that comes out of your talk, or your comments too, is so Trump doesn't know very much about foreign policy, and he's very unpredictable on it because he hasn't thought about it very much. So he probably doesn't have very firm attitudes about it. He's also been, disavowed by the Republican foreign policy establishment. There was a letter, of foreign policy experts, which were essentially condemning him. So when he comes, if he were to be elected, and he were to come to Washington and then try and fill his cabinet, I guess he would pick people who are not from the normal places, the normal think tanks that you would have in Washington. And normally, I think that even if you're an outsider and you come to Washington, then you fill your cabinet with insiders, that sort of grounds you in terms of continuity in foreign policy. And
locks
the
you in.
bureaucracy does that too. Yeah. Might we have a situation where you actually could have big change because you have an outsider who will bring in outsiders?
Or a high degree of unpredictability, since you don't know what outsiders would come in. Well, first off, let me tackle a question about why I said Bernie is not Obama, or that he differs from Obama. I have to say, I personally share a lot of the restraint in the attitude that Obama talked about in that interview. That it was a very sympathetic interview, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of how the difference from Obama's point of view of how America should engage the world. What I find somewhat troubling is that the interview does not reflect other things, if you will, that the Obama administration has done and is doing, that are more interventionist, right? And let me just cite two or three of them as examples. Excuse me. Always turn off your cell phone. Number one is while the Obama administration while Obama's attitude is one of relative restraint, at the same time, under the rubric of basically special operations capabilities and under authorities largely created in what's called Section 1208 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which involves counterinsurgency and counterterrorist operations. The special forces of the United States are highly deployed around the world, highly deployed in over 80 countries. Engaged in everything from actual combat operations to serious training operations to combat support operations to spotting for attacks by indigenous forces. And that has been, at the same time as restraint, it has been a much more below-the-radar intervention of the United States in over 80 countries around the world. It suggests that the restraint is not as consistent a theme as the president laid out in that interview with The Atlantic. Longer discussion, but in my judgment, it's a kind of intervention that is likely to cause us intense blowback and a lot of difficulties down the road. Longer discussion I want to talk about in Q&A we can. So that's one example. The second example is drone operations. Drone operations have became for a while, I think they've leveled off a bit, but they became for a while the go-to capability to deal with terrorists and terrorist organizations. Intervention, if you will, without putting boots on the ground, but intervention nonetheless, and seen in the countries where the drone strikes were being operated as an intrusion into the territorial space of those countries. And whether you agree with or not the objective of killing terrorists, it's an intervention. It's not a policy of restraint. It's a less visible intervention, right? The decision to engage in regime change in Libya is yet another example of an intervention that has had horrendous consequences. Not that Gaddafi was, a beautiful guy, but it's had horrendous consequences not only for the country of Libya, but for the stability of the countries south of Libya as a consequence. So thinking through some of these interventions might have been wise. At the periphery of foreign policy, I'm thinking about government secrecy and the uses of the National Security Agency and a number of issues of that kind, where the administration has surprisingly been somewhat more secretive than its predecessor. Which is quite
And your
interesting.
sense is that a Sanders presidency would be much more restrained?
I think significantly more restrained than that.
Do we have any, I'm going to skip the last question I asked. We'll just come
Okay,
to that
forget
later.
the last
'Cause
question.
I'm going to go, could you compare the candidates on Syria and ISIS?
Yeah, that's,
Might get at it.
there, and I have to say this is equally true of Sanders, because he does talk about this in his speech at Salt Lake City. When push comes to shove, all this, Trump says, "I'm going to beat them and fast." That's literally a quote. Okay? Good for you. Like that. That's bold attitude. We don't have much detail on exactly how that's supposed to be executed. Ted Cruz says essentially the same thing, along with a little sprinkling of carpet bombing that he at one point suggested might be an appropriate tactic. There, I think if he brought in anybody but Frank Gaffney, his hand would be stayed by the people who appointed him, saying, "Wait a minute, you're really going to think about whether you want to do that, because the blowback consequences of that are horrendous, Mr. President." I think probably the most articulated ISIS strategy is Hillary Clinton's. It doesn't go as far as Ted Cruz, but it's basically no-fly zone and more support, armed support for local indigenous forces. Everybody, including Bernie Sanders, says, well, no, I shouldn't say that. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders say, in the struggle with ISIS, the primary responsibility is with the indigenous countries and forces in the region. Cruz, in his day, Rubio, Kasich, again, Trump's a bit of a wild card here because he hasn't given you any detail, all have not made as much a point, if you will, of saying it's really primarily the responsibility of the countries in the region. Trump has said that and not said that at the same time. So go figure. Maybe he would go in and carpet bomb him. Maybe he'd just say, "We're walking." I don't think you could predict the outcome.
So back to the question of Trump being unmoored. That usually I think it's a common pattern that candidates in a campaign will always talk about how terrible the status quo is, how we have to set a new course, how we have to change things. But then when they get in office, you often see continuity. Though I wonder, and I think that continuity comes again from taking advisors from resident think tanks or the bureaucracy itself. Mm-hmm. You wonder though, with a Trump as president, if his advisors didn't come from those places, and he himself doesn't have set beliefs,
or listen to advice, as far as we can determine.
Would he be, whether you might actually get change?
You might actually get change, but it would be wildly unpredictable.
Right.
You have no idea what direction it would go. Probably the most significant foreign policy act that he would attempt to do and would probably fail is to build that goddamn wall. The ones the Mexicans are going to pay for, right? Well, we know, because most of us are sentient and rational, that the Mexicans would pay for that wall when hell froze over, right? So we know that that's just not going to happen. So there's an idea that he could walk in with, but here's the reality that Donald Trump would encounter. This is somebody who has no experience of actually working issues in Washington. I can see the budget proposal now that has $10 billion in it to build a wall across the United States. Love to see what happens to that in the House and the Senate. No idea what would happen to that in the House and the Senate. And so you're unpredictable. You're in unpredictable land with him. Anybody here know, when Trump's foreign policy advisor list was released, anybody here recognize any of the names? Raise your hands. Not all at once. Boy, I don't know. This is don't they get education in American university? I mean, wow. No, I mean, nobody had heard of him, basically. And a wild card assembly of
Right.
very strange individuals. You know, I'm not saying some might not be smart or not smart. It's just no idea where this list of people came from or what they would really think or what they would really do were they in office. So part of your question comes to an institutional question. Even if you brought in, a deck of jokers and put them in policy positions, right? Would the bureaucracy respond? And this has raised some very interesting issues, including civil-military relations issues. You know, if the President of the United States is about to do something that is a violation of international treaty and convention and law, what is the responsibility of the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? What is the chair supposed to say at that point? No, Mr. President, I refuse to obey that order. It's against the Geneva Convention, right? Yes, by law, that's what he's supposed to say. Mm-hmm. So we got some high degree of unpredictability in how the senior levels of the senior executive service or the military leadership would respond to the rhetoric of the Trump campaign, if it actually were an action that the president tried to undertake from the Oval Office. It could present some really interesting case studies for people who do civil-military relations, because the military is bound by some of those conventions to do exactly opposite things from some of the things that he said on the campaign trail. So you'd be setting up a really, it's a reporter's dream of a series of decisions and interventions and contentions and wild things if he did all of these things, right? But since we don't know, and he's even internally contradictory as to whether he would do all of these things, I mean, I ask you, who's writing the memo for Benjamin Netanyahu right now?
Right.
Taking the two quotes that I read you.
Right.
And saying, here's what President Trump would do. Well, he came to AIPAC, Mr. Prime Minister, and said this, but 2 weeks earlier he said that.
Which raises a question.
You tell me.
You used to teach, I think it was a class on why do they hate us or how do they see us?
I did.
That was a class about how the rest of the world looks at U.S. foreign policy. Jumping off of that, how do you think the rest of the world now is looking at this campaign?
With fear and loathing. I don't think, one way or another, I've been focused on presidential campaigns every 4 years since 1950. So an awfully long time. And I have never seen a presidential campaign as lunatic as this presidential campaign. And it's not on the Democratic side, because the Democratic side is pretty predictable. Mm-hmm. Who supports Sanders, who supports Clinton, what they argue for, what the differences are between them, and ultimately some kind of resolution of that, I'm certain, is going to happen. It's on the Republican side. It really is bizarre. And I'm saying that on the basis of every 4 years from 1950. It's really bizarre. Now, Phil Brenner, who's in the back, pointed out that I did not, in fact, include in my database, I was too young, the Benjamin Harrison campaign of, what was it, 86? 88, where epithets were flung, including the parentage of illegitimate children for the candidates and all kinds of wonderful things. So it's not unprecedented for there to be tomfoolery in American presidential elections, but in my lifetime, I've never seen anything quite this wild.
I haven't seen elections where you've had foreign leaders comment on the election while the election is happening as much as this one. Between the British and the Mexicans and the Obama during the nuclear summit said that the leaders came up to him and were concerned.
I think, foreign policy leaders and prime ministers and foreign ministers are scratching their heads and saying, oh my God, what are the Americans up to now? This is crazy. Right? They haven't seen anything like this in their lifetimes either. So definitely a problem.
So I just want to ask two more questions and then open it up. I want to bring you old wine, new bottles. What does this mean for defense spending and your area of expertise? And what does the differences in the candidates, what are the prospects for a change in the balance of our national security institutions? You have long written about the imbalance in the Defense Department versus the other agencies that conduct foreign policy, and our book documents the mission creep of the military into lots of different areas. What are the prospects for change in that trend from this election?
Well, just when you think things could get worse, they get worse. The defense budget of the United States tends to have a sort of talismanic quality. It is the expression of our commitment to our security. Right? You are for more defense spending. You want to cut the defense budget. The rhetoric itself suggests the talismanic quality of it. It's a mythology about the defense budget as an expression of our commitment to American national security. We are right now in an upswing in the defense budget already. We're already going there, right? Independent of what any candidate is saying. We're going there, and we're going there. It's a longer discussion, but under the influence of bureaucratic and political and foreign policy situations that all impel it upwards. So what's interesting about that is that the drawdown that we just did in the defense budget between 2010 and 2015 was the most shallow drawdown that we have done in constant dollars of any defense drawdown starting with the Korean War. Shallow. So that if you look at the curve of the defense budget and you look at, Korea down, Vietnam down, Reagan buildup down, the last 15 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, up, and then it's tailing off. It tails off down between 2010 and 2015, but at a level that is $100 to $125 billion higher in constant dollars than the Cold War average, including war spending. So we've set already a new high, and we have dipped about 20% from that new high in constant dollars, and we're now about to go up. We are definitely on an upward trend. Talk about the details, but some of it involves budgetary fol-de-rol, like using the war budget to get extra money into the defense budget and things like that. So it's going up, and it's going up. I think if any of these people except Bernie Sanders is elected, it will continue to go up. Hillary Clinton may be on a slightly more gradual slope, but it will go up. Here the influence of the advisors will be absolutely critical. She comes from the centrist tradition in the Democratic Party. They are very, I worked for her husband. They are very cautious about the level of the defense budget and the vulnerabilities for Democrats of causing it to go down. So keeping it high is part of the centrist Democratic mantra. Ted Cruz has already said he wants to put 4% of the American gross domestic product into the defense budget, which would add about $140 billion a year to the current level of defense spending, which is already $150 billion over the Cold War average. So he's going up. Anybody can tell you Donald Trump's defense budget number? Come see me after the talk. Because I don't know. You can tell me. Kasich is in the same ballpark, to the degree Kasich is a surviving candidate. So in all circumstances, the defense budget will go up. Right? That's except Sanders. And Sanders has clearly said, no, it will not go up. The balance of the institutions would be affected as a consequence, right? Because the balance of the imbalance of institutions emerges from a number of sources, which we describe in our book. If you haven't bought it, immediately race out to your nearest publisher. It's called Mission Creep. And it's a really great book. But the balance of the institutions is already eroded over a 40 or 50-year period. It continues to erode in the future. And if the Defense Department is the beneficiary of an increase in resources, it only adds to the imbalance. It only says, and now you will have more resources on the defense side to do a lot of things with the military, including things that are not combat operations, and that's a lot of what we talk about in the book. So I expect the imbalance to be perpetuated. The only, again, Sanders is the outlier, who has emphasized in the things he's written and what he has said so far, greater emphasis on conflict prevention, conflict resolution, foreign assistance, diplomacy. You know, he is at least rhetorically in the ballpark of strengthening the civilian tools of statecraft. I don't know that he would be so formal as to describe that as what he's focused on, but it's the balance of what he said.
Wasn't Hillary Clinton very supportive and effective, actually, in getting the Robert Gates as Secretary of Defense to at least support her as Secretary of State, and also arguing for increased resources in the State Department? So she might have an eye toward not cutting defense, but raising other agencies.
That's a fair point, and I think as president, she would, be rhetorically committed to keeping civilian capabilities strong. That said, she did have her view of her role as Secretary of State vis-a-vis the Defense Department was basically to allow no daylight between herself and the Secretary of Defense. As a consequence of that view, she allowed over a 4-year period authorities that the State Department was responsible for in the areas of security cooperation and security assistance to erode into the Defense Department because she didn't want any daylight between herself and the Secretary of Defense. She did get Gates's verbal support for what the State Department was doing, and frankly, a lot of the uniformed military would like that to happen. Right? There's some of the people who don't really like the roles that they're being asked to do around the world. But that's where the money is, right? The other opportunity that she had, and here I think it was an opportunity missed, was she oversaw, the first quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, QDDR as it was known, in 2010. In that QDDR, she had an opportunity to restructure and reinvigorate the State Department in a way that might have amplified the message of give us more, we can do a better job now. She did not do it. And the one reform that was proposed in that QDDR, which was to enhance the conflict prevention, conflict resolution part of the State Department, was basically a dead letter. It was implemented. It created a new, complex contingency stability operations office, bureau, but that bureau has been underfunded, understaffed, and not very effective as a result. So she had the right language, she did some of the right things in money terms, but didn't follow through in actually taking on the issue of how do you strengthen the State Department and, from my point of view, actually wrestle away some of the things that the Defense Department has done because they are essentially diplomatic requirements rather than military ones.
Let's go into the audience, and I will come around with the mic, and you can ask questions.
Hello. Good afternoon, Professor. Welcome back to AU. You hear me?
Yeah, okay. You have to hold these mics. You have to swallow the mic, as they say.
I'm going to put it right here, see how this works. The first question I have, it's a two-parter, so it's not going to be too long, but the first part is, do you think that the House and Senate will pass an actual budget before the election is over? That way they can lock in the rates before President Trump or President Sanders comes in. That way they can prevent any, with the CR, the president would be able to have some influence later. But do you think they would actually pass a real budget? And the second question is, how would President Sanders use his OCO funding, his Overseas Contingency Operations funding? Thank you.
Second one's very hard to answer because he hasn't said anything about it. I anticipate that he would be unfriendly to the concept that you have a budget outside the defense budget that's actually more money for the defense budget. My expectation, he did serve on the budget committee, so he's not unfamiliar with budgetary ledger domain, and that's one of the big pieces of budgetary ledger domain that's going on. But it's hard to answer the question in detail, and I don't know that the campaign will ever get granular enough for anybody to answer that one. On the pass the budget, simple answer, no. The House and Senate will be incapable of passing budget resolutions that it'll be stopped in the Senate, and there will be a budget resolution in the House, and it will not pass the Senate. So you won't have a budget resolution. The appropriators will try to pump out a bunch of appropriations bills. There should be 12 of them. They're saying by July 4th, not a snowball's chance in hell. So almost certainly we will have a continuing resolution to a lame duck. And if I'm wrong about this, I'll give anybody in the House $50. I mean, we're going to CR. We're going straight to a CR. And the reason is nobody is going to cut a deal before they know how the election came out. It'll be a different deal depending on who wins, right? So why make a deal on the budget when you don't know if your person or their person is going to be in the White House? So the incentive not to have a deal is very powerful, and I think it will overwhelm anybody's effort to pass appropriations bills.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you back. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
your insights. So I find a little bit of a contradiction in what you're saying, and if you could help us understand a debate we're having in one of my classes, and this is about the importance of the individual versus the institution. And so you seem to say, in the case of someone like Trump, he'll be confronted by the bureaucracy. He might not be able to get anything done. People will act like that. But in the case of Bernie Sanders, he might be able to get some things done. And I wonder if the bureaucracy might revolt against him too. I wonder if when you talk about the Jeffrey Goldberg interview in The Atlantic, if the distance between what Obama would have liked to do and what he was able to do wasn't that problem of confronting a machinery that he couldn't operate with to get him to do what he wanted.
Yeah, that's a very good question. My instinct on that, Phil, is a Sanders would be likely to encounter less bureaucratic resistance to what he wanted to do, because especially in the foreign policy arena, most of what he wants to do is not foreign to the bureaucracy. The Defense Department, the services, probably would, but maybe not as vigorously as one thinks. The reason I say that is because my experience is the people least likely to want to intervene, if intervention's the policy test that we're asked about, least likely to want to intervene are actually the uniformed military. They're a notoriously conservative institution, and they have been frustrating to a lot of presidents as a result, because you'll go into a meeting in the Situation Room and they'll say, "How would you like to sign up for an intervention?" And they'll sit on their hands. Well, that would be very dangerous, Mr. President. And this couldn't do this and we couldn't do that. It's very frustrating to presidents to have the military not be leading the charge for intervention. So I'm not sure he would encounter that. The difficulty that he would encounter is the Congress. That's the big problem for Bernie Sanders is not, while he was a much more effective member of the Senate than people give him credit for, because he knew how to play his hand on amendments and things very cleverly, and he worked with a lot of people. He's not embedded in the party structure like any other candidate like Hillary would be. And he'd have to do a lot of work to bring along a majority in the Congress. I think the things he wants to do, and depending on how the congressional elections come out, it could be a big problem, because if he won the presidency and the Republicans held the Congress, we'd have fireworks. I mean, it'd be really hard for him to get to the goal line on some of the things which personally I support, but are extremely hard to realize in American domestic politics in particular, right? Obama is a very interesting conundrum. I think it's a very, very good question because in one area where I'm doing a little bit of work right now, which is the modernization programs in the nuclear field, ICBMs, bomber programs, SLBMs, nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, new warheads. In all of those areas, the Obama administration has moved in a direction that is inconsistent, in my judgment, with the commitments that he made in Europe very early on in his administration to pointing towards a reduced role of nuclear weapons in American foreign policy. And in trying to reason through why I think they're inconsistent, because we're now going down the road of $1 trillion worth of spending on new ICBMs, new bomber programs, new ballistic missile submarines, cruise missiles, warheads, I think one explanation for that may be the impact of bureaucracy on resisting. Is the National Nuclear Security Administration, what Obama wants to do is inconsistent with the bureaucratic logic, the priesthood of nuclear weapons at NNSA. It's just plain inconsistent. And they resist when that happens. And sometimes they resist in a way that I won't say blackmails the president, makes it very hard for the president to proceed because they will basically in the priesthood say you're sacrificing the readiness, reliability of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And that's not something a president wants to have said about what he did. So they will resist, and the Defense Department is going to pose a challenge on nuclear modernization, and the president signed up for this. By saying, in order to fund these programs, Mr. President, you're going to have to create a special budget for nuclear weapons modernization for the delivery vehicles, the subs, the cruise missiles, the aircraft, the land-based missiles, because we don't want those resources competing with the conventional equipment we want to buy in the service budgets. So make a special budget, Mr. President. And when the president or the secretary of defense turns around and says, well, I'll make a special budget. Okay, that sounds good. Now, each of you is going to chip in some money to pay for this, right, from your own procurement budgets. You know what the services are going to say. No, Mr. President, that's now on your hand. So what you have to go back to the Congress and negotiate is an agreement that raises the entire ceiling for defense to accommodate the cost of nuclear modernization. Right? So he's got that's a very classic case of bureaucratic resistance and bureaucratic pressure against an objective of the president. If you haven't read Mort Halperin's book, Bureaucratic Politics and Foreign Policy, go back and read the new edition because it describes how hard it is for presidents to get things done in the bureaucracy really right, very nicely. And this is a classic case. So I think it's possible to say some of what Obama wanted to do meets bureaucratic resistance and has been done as a consequence. But note, I did not say the intervention programs. I did not say the drone operations or the special operators in 80 countries. And those have been presidential decisions. That's not the military services or the spec ops guys saying, we're going to do this, Mr. President, and even though you don't want us to do that, no. It's a choice that the president made to operate that way and to develop those programs. And there's enough in the public array literature now to say, yeah, this is how he chose to do it. This was a deliberate choice, and it was kind of disconcerting that Goldberg didn't ask about it and it wasn't touched on in the Atlantic interview.
Thank you for speaking to us, Professor. Going deeper into that Atlantic interview, one idea proposed that would be real change guided by restraint is a general divestment from the Middle East. Can we discuss that notion? Is it feasible? And I'd accompany that with a side argument that the U.S. national interest in preserving the free flow of hydrocarbons from the Gulf would be preserved by Iran or Saudi or whoever ends up taking control of the Middle East because it's in their national interest too if we left.
Yeah, Middle East, when I was in graduate school, long time ago, I tried to decide what geographic area of the world that I wanted to focus on. That would affect language choices, it would affect course choices and so on. And I decided I did not want to study the Middle East because it was unsolvable. This is the 1960s, right? A long time ago. It looked unsolvable then, and it looks unsolvable now. You know, I actually made the wrong choice as a career choice because I would have been working forever if I focused on the Middle East, because it is unsolvable, and therefore people work on it forever, right? Here's my sort of central sense about it, and I think this is consistent with what Obama said. I think it's consistent with what Sanders said in his speech. And it goes to this question of the interventionist consensus and American exceptionalism more broadly, which is, it is stunning how little capacity the United States has to influence the flow of events in the Middle East today, let alone in the future. And the assumption of many people is not my natural assumption, but after going through the career I went through, it's natural to start thinking the way the consensus thinks because it's all around you. The consensus position is, we got to do something. We got to do something. And that's why people are struggling around the Syria and ISIS thing, is because no matter what we really think of that we can do, it's not going to affect the outcome very much. That the outcome is driven in that region by a series of colonial and post-colonial decisions, ethnic and religious decisions and confrontations, 700 years, 800 years, 900 years of history, embedded economic problems, a series of things that the United States just doesn't have the capacity to step in and say, you go in that corner and you go in that corner and we're done. You know, and that's what the rhetoric of a Donald Trump would have you do, and it's what Ted Cruz would do, and the interventionist and exceptionalist consensus says if we do something, everybody else will follow. And the Middle East is now the litmus case of sticking your finger in the bramble and getting stuck. We can't, and that's frustrating because we ought to be able to reason our way through to something that we can do. But the reality, I think, in my view, is we can't. And so anything from my point of view that allows us to kind of extend our arms around what's going on but not intrude, and push in the diplomatic direction, knowing we're likely to fail in a number of instances, is about the best we can do. And any more interventionist use of American military capabilities to try to resolve those issues has enormous backfire potential on the United States in creating greater enmity, blowback, resistance, frustration in the region. Because we can't change it, but we're seriously sticking our nose in there in a business that's a mess. And that's a technical term. That's a mess. Okay, so do we have to do it because of oil? No. Oil is a fungible commodity. We are less dependent on imports than we used to be. Oil comes from other places, including the territory of the United States, and that's a fracking issue, and that's a separate debate. But we are, I think, policy has not caught up with the reality of the hydrocarbon market. I think it will, but it hasn't caught up with it yet. I think it's already giving the United States more leverage to not engage and less leverage to the Saudis, who have had enormous leverage over the United States in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Not a full answer, but this is one of the situations that doesn't have a full answer.
The president has, for a long time, thought of the Asia as being the area we should interact with and strongly interact with in the future. How do the candidates feel about that, and what will their approaches be?
Yeah, good question. In general, Pacific pivot and Pacific rebalancing and that kind of thing, those are bumper stickers. The reality is we've been engaged for decades in the Pacific, and the reality is that, one way or another, we have to do at least this sort of keep our arms around the Middle East problem. And, reality has a way of intruding on the best laid bumper sticker. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to sort of say, well, okay, now we're not interested in Europe and Russia and Middle East anymore. We're over here. I don't think that's the way reality works. That said, the candidates, again, Trump wildcard, are generally consistent on a continuum about dealing with China, which is, the 800-pound gorilla in the Asian Pacific policy theater. But it's a continuum from the sort of Cruz and one day Trump, one day not Trump position of I'm going to tear up all our trade agreements and we're going to make those Chinese behave, to I make deals. Cruz is in a more confrontational rhetoric with the Chinese. We've got to tackle them head on the Spratlys and the 9-dash line and the Chinese perimeter, and most everybody is in favor of assisting countries in the region strengthen their capabilities to do internal balancing vis-a-vis the Chinese in the region. I think Clinton's probably a little more balanced on it. It's one of the areas where Sanders has said less. But I think by extrapolation, you have to say that he would be fairly tough on economic issues because of his position on trade agreements. The one area where Sanders has a very clearly articulated policy is on trade agreements. He thinks they're bad. He thinks they've done us a disservice. He thinks they've cost us jobs. It's somewhat disputable and debatable, but there's some reality to it too. So the mixture of issues would be something he'd have to deal with. So you go from kind of confrontational, almost warlike, to more balanced approaches in dealing with the major player. One of the interesting things that's happening there, and this for me fits in a larger sort of sense that I have of what's been going on in the world for the last 20 years in particular, which is there's a kind of a regional and global rebalancing going on as a consequence of both military and economic changes, that the capacity of the United States to halt is zero. The need for the United States to adjust is large. The exact way to adjust is contested. Do you do it through confrontation and resistance? Do you do it through accommodating other powers doing other things? And this has an interesting implication for the Pacific. I was at a panel this morning at the Stimson Center who were talking about SIPRI's new data. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has just published its spending data, global military spending. And in the global military spending data set, one of the interesting things is the rise in the last 2 or 3 years in defense budgets in the countries in the Asian Pacific region. The Japanese they've passed the Brits in terms of total defense expenditure. I think they're number 5 on the list. The Australians have seen something like a 21% growth in defense budgets in the last 2 years. The Vietnamese are buying especially ships, coastal vessels, maritime patrol aircraft, and spending a great deal more in their defense spending. So there is an almost predictable phenomenon going on in Asia with the rise of China by the other countries in the region who have to live right next door to the Chinese. So to my judgment, the biggest challenge that we've got in the Pacific is being able to accommodate the rise of a China that is both militarily capable and economically powerful without running into tripwires. I don't think, for the most part, Trump is predictable on this issue, although he's very confrontational on the Chinese question. Cruz is more militarily oriented on the question than he is economically. Clinton's got a more balanced program, and Sanders has not said much about it outside of trade agreements.
Hi. My question for you is, based on your comments with the potential increase in bureaucratic politics that a potential candidate may face once they become president, is if that slows down a president's ability, how would that look towards the international community for any of the president's first term, in terms of being able to leverage America's credibility?
In terms of, say again?
Like America's credibility in the international community.
Yeah, it's a very speculative. It's a very good question. The foreign countries, non-American countries, and there are a lot of them, 197 last I looked, are often flummoxed by American foreign policy, and it's not peculiar, especially to the next administration. And they're somewhat flummoxed because most countries have an internal governmental structure for making and implementing foreign policy decisions that is essentially non-democratic. Little d, it's non-democratic in the sense that most of them, especially our major allies, have parliamentary systems. And once they've elected a prime minister and the prime minister has appointed a cabinet, in a parliamentary system, prime ministers tend to command a parliamentary majority most of the time. So the things they do, when they say they're going to do something, they can do it because they can command a majority in their legislature, and it will pass it, and it will be done. We have a really zooey, iconoclastic, weird political system in this country. This is not, there's not a lot of countries structured politically the way we are. When you've separated the executive branch from the legislature, you've essentially let the legislature in the door in making a lot of major decisions, including committing resources. No action may be taken by the executive branch except as a result of an appropriation by the Congress of the United States, which is why I always liked budgets, because that's where it is in American politics, right? If the money ain't there, it ain't a policy. So, but we have this bifurcated thing where the president will say, I'm signing up to this in an international meeting, and then he's got to go and bend elbows for a year or two with the Congress to get them to do something. So the other countries are disconcerted by our system, and not many of them understand it. They don't really, because they're used to systems where if I got elected, I got a majority, and I say it goes, I'm putting a budget, and we're done. What's the problem? And believe me, I've encountered this as a policymaker. You're talking to foreign representatives of embassies and things, and they're saying, well, you said you were going to spend this amount of money on this thing. I say, you don't understand American politics, let me tell you. Right? You had to explain the peculiarities of our system. So they're already disconcerted, right, by the United States. Add the wrangling that could happen. As I said to Professor Brenner, hard to predict with Sanders, but I think almost certain to happen with an intuitive thinker like Donald Trump. They're going to be very disconcerted indeed. My own judgment would be it would have a very, if you think the United States is looked to as a global leader, and I don't think it always is, and I think that's changing rapidly, nonetheless, being sure that the nation could commit itself to the things that the president said it could commit itself to would rise, the uncertainty would rise in other countries, which is part of why I think so many of them have been saying things out of school, because generally they don't comment on American presidential contests, but there have been a lot of comments, including the ambassador to New Zealand yesterday, our ambassador, that say maybe the Americans are getting unpredictable here. And that compromises your capacity to show consistent impact, if not leadership.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Afternoon.
To what extent do you think that the upcoming election would affect the relationship of the United States with the countries of the hemisphere, of the Western Hemisphere, not only regarding the Cuban issue, but, for example, the raise in the budget for foreign aid for Colombia or for the Central American countries?
Mm-hmm. Again, hard to predict in detail. I think the one thing that all of the Republican candidates have been clear about is they do not like the opening to Cuba and would proceed no further if not roll some of it back. And since, as we've seen, President Obama has been able to do a number of things that aren't constrained by what the Congress or the current embargoed relationship with Cuba is in law, the president has a lot of liberty to roll these things back too, if he or she wants to, right? So from almost any of the Republican candidates, I would expect at least no effort to change the embargo. And at least that, and probably some rollback in some of the things that the Obama administration has done. I see Professor Brenner nodding his head over there, so I know I'm not on the thinnest ice in the world here, I hope. I don't expect much change if it's a Hillary Clinton. I expect it to proceed forward with Sanders, and that's partly because Sanders has been very clear and been criticized by Hillary Clinton for saying it, that he would want to push forward on talks with the Iranians, talks with the Cubans, ending the embargo. I mean, he leans very far forward on that set of issues. Colombia, I think nobody has expressed enough policy detail on for us to know what would happen in Colombia. Venezuela, same question. There's a lot of rhetorical objection to the Venezuelan government, but I haven't seen enough detail to say granularly what would you do that's different. Could be confronted with stability issues in Brazil, given what's going on, right? That is going to require some kind of a policy response, but again, no detail from any of the candidates. For better or for worse, policy towards Latin America in American foreign policy in general and in presidential elections in particular is not a huge central issue. The big question, I think, would be immigration. The two big issues that, and I haven't seen any of the candidates say much on counter-narcotics because that's the other big issue, but the immigration issue linked to the terrorism issue is a hot potato, and since a fair amount of that flow comes across the southern border of the United States, that immigration policy is, an area where restraint is obviously the view of most of the Republican candidates, if not wall building on the part of Donald Trump. And I would expect something more balanced from Clinton and something even more forward-leaning from Sanders. All of them, and this is worth looking on the web, all of them have statements on immigration because it's a hot potato. And I think the immigration issue is probably the primary source of friction in U.S. relationships with many of the Latin American countries right now.
Thank you for coming today, Professor Adams. I was just curious, despite a history of failed foreign policy interventions and foibles abroad, why do so many candidates and politicians continue to pursue a policy of intervention, foreign policy intervention?
We got another hour? History is the short answer to the question. History and a widely accepted policy consensus that the United States is one way or another responsible for events around the globe. I mean, it's very interesting to, it's almost if you got a gun, you might as well use it. The United States has the only military that operates globally. The only one. There's not another country that does. Not one. Not the Chinese, not the Russians, not the French, not the British, not the Iranians, not the Indians. Only the United States. We have the only military that can fly everywhere, deploy everywhere, sail everywhere. We have the only military that has a global set of installations and capabilities for communications, for intelligence gathering, for logistics, for transportation. The only military in the world. It's one of the reasons it costs so much money that it's cost. Only one of the reasons, but it's one of the reasons because the United States has owned a global military role since the 1950s. And it's the only country that has. And that has become so embedded in the architecture of how we think about things, what we think we need to think about, why we almost intuitively say, oh my gosh, there's a crisis in Somalia, we better do something about it. Oh my gosh, the Mozambican government just fell, what's our policy? You think the British worry about that? No. The Chinese worry about that? No. Right? So we have a I mean, the guy who writes about this most eloquently probably is Andy Bacevich from Boston University, repetitiously in a series of books about the ethos of being responsible for the world and what that then drives in terms of institutions, budgets, spending, interventions, and attitudes in the American populace. So the answer really is history, but we need another hour to go through the architecture.
Thank you for coming out here, Professor Adams. You touched upon this earlier about civil-military relations. I would like to hear more on comparative between the candidates on potential civil-military relations, especially with the outlier Trump and Sanders.
You know, one could be tempted to say, well, they haven't really talked about this issue. That said, they have really talked about this issue, but only implicitly, right? And the implicit conversation is important, right? The implicit conversation, and it comes back in part to what the question I was just answering, the implicit conversation is the most important demonstration of America's leadership and capabilities around the world is its military. Now that implies a civil-military relationship. It does not describe it like Sam Huntington or some scholar would describe it, but it says, if I want to tell you I'm tough, I'm putting a lot of money there. If I want to tell you I'm tough, I'm raising the size of the ground force of the United States Army from 475,000 to 550,000, which is what Cruz has said. He's the only one who's got details on this. I'm put 4.1% of the gross domestic product into that budget and add $140 billion a year to it. I'm going to empower that institution. That is a way of saying that institution is the cutting edge of the way I view America's engagement in the world. It's the demonstration of our intention. It is the details on our capability. That's what we're going to do. Now, Trump has said those things, but he's got no program, so I have no idea in detail what he would do. Kasich has also said the same things, not the same numbers as Cruz, but he's basically said that's the most important institution. And all of them have said the military's gone to hell in a handbasket over the last 8 years, every one of them. I hate to tell you what that is. It's a lie. I won't put too fine a point on it. It's a lie, and I could spend an hour telling you why it's a lie, but it's a lie. The United States still has that incredible military I just described. They can fly anywhere, deploy anywhere, sail anywhere, operate globally, yada, yada. We still got it. We always had it. In the special operations area alone, we have 70,000 people in special operations. That's bigger than the militaries of all but about 10 countries in the world, right? So don't tell me this is an unready, disastrous, generals do that to raise budget dollars, but it's not true. It's a lie. But it's a conveniently political lie, because it says I can then make us strong again, make America great, by investing in the military, right? There are only 1.5 candidates who have said, I can make America great, but I can do it by focusing on conflict resolution and conflict prevention and foreign assistance and engagement in trade and blah, 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 and that's Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, with varying degrees of emphasis. Those are the only ones that institutionally are saying there are other institutions that execute American foreign policy and we're going to use them, right? Those are implied statements about civil-military relations. They're not direct, but they're implied, and it comes back to my answer to the question that Professor Murray put to me about who emerges affect the institutional imbalance in the American government. And I think the answer is yes.
Thank you, Professor Adams, for coming back. It's always a pleasure to have you here. My question is kind of focusing on the election. I feel like it's really brought about like the seedy underbelly of opinions that have been out there, but kind of were not brought to the front until recently. And for a room full of future foreign policy makers and various facets of foreign policy, what advice do you have for us? Is it just an uphill battle from here on up? Like when we get out there into the different institutions that help formulate foreign policy, what should we look for? Or what should we focus on? Just any advice you have would be helpful. Thank you.
We'll have a session of career counseling after the.
I'm wondering,
Yeah.
we only have 10 minutes left, so maybe we could just group two more questions? Two more questions?
Hi, Professor. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I was just wondering, what do you think the role of the intelligence community might be in some of these different institutions, considering that, I mean, it might seem more politically favorable to use the intelligence community if you don't want to commit to, say, boots on the ground and instead use covert operations?
And kind of alluding to her point before, there's an increasing trends of political appointees in the State Department, despite despite their parties or their positions as intervention and non-intervention. Do you see that trend continuing, specifically considering the outliers of Trump and Sanders?
And I have class at 5:30, so I will cut you off at 5:30.
I can't just go on. Okay, let me come back to the career question. Let me start with yours about the intelligence community. We have way too large an intelligence community. We have way too many institutions in the intelligence community, and we have too many redundancies in the intelligence community. That said, any self-respecting nation needs an intelligence capability. If you're going to play a role in anything outside your borders, you need to know what's going on. So you need to have the capability to know what's going on. And I've never had much of a quarrel with the analytical capabilities in an intelligence community. That makes sense to me. Open source, closed source, various types of intelligence disciplines. And I've never had, from my perspective, any difficulty advising students, speaking of career choices, that working on the analytical side of the intelligence community is a worthy enterprise. It is a worthy enterprise. It's conflicted, it's difficult, but for me, the issue in the intelligence community that is more important today than almost any other, there's maybe another one that's equally important, but that is the move by largely the Central Intelligence Agency back into a highly operational role. And by operational role, I mean shooters. I mean people who come out of the special forces, the special ops that go into the intelligence community, just change their shirt, and they become gunners for the intelligence community. And not only do I have difficulty with it substantively because of the involvement I talked about earlier that it engages us in a bunch of countries, but in this case through the intelligence community, I have severe reservations about it because of the risk of corruption of the analytical side. That when the director of the Central Intelligence Agency sits in a situation room meeting and is asked about the situation report for an operation in a particular area, and he or she has people on the ground shooting in that situation, the opportunity for corrupting the intelligence product is enormous because they got a stake in the outcome. So the good news stories have got to be more important than the bad news stories, and the things that you got to hear, Mr. President or Ms. President, and the things that I'm going to tell you can be hugely different. I can't sit here and point you case by case where that's happened, mostly because a lot of those conversations are classified, and I don't have the transcript. I just worry about the corruption of the act of knowing by becoming a player in the operation. The forces in the intelligence community that love doing this are legion. They love it. They absolutely love it. And it goes right up to and includes my former boss and a guy I admire and respect a lot, Leon Panetta. I worked for him at OMB. But Leon was taking an almost salacious pleasure in being an operator and being a soldier through the intelligence community. And it worried the hell out of me. Push came to shove, they did the Osama bin Laden operation with SEALs. They didn't do it with CIA operatives. But that to me is the biggest risk in intelligence. Some people might find that fun, but for me it's a very corrupting enterprise. Political appointees to wherever thus, I'm tempted to say, although there is in recent practice a tendency, particularly at state, to go deeper into the DAS level and director level with political appointees. Who was it? You raised that question? Yeah. Political appointees. You know, you're going to have some smart people, you're going to have some not so smart people when you do that, but what you're not going to have is continuity. And that continuity can be important in moving foreign policy from one administration to a next administration. So there's downside risk, I think, of making a lot of those political appointee jobs. I'm less concerned, I have to say, about ambassadors. Some people say, 35% of American ambassadors are political appointees. Yeah, well, you know, the Foreign Service doesn't like this much because it means fewer billets for people who want to move upwards. But I haven't seen a policy consequence of political ambassadorial appointees that leads me to the conclusion I just drew about intelligence. Oh my God, it's corrupting the process, it's destroying our foreign relations. The reality is some FSOs are good ambassadors and some aren't, and some political appointed ambassadors are good ambassadors and some aren't. I'd like better screening on it, but I'm realistic about American politics. If you give a lot of money to a campaign and there's an embassy open, you may end up there.